Hi guys, I'm Dr. Tara Tobias. I want to welcome you all back to this channel. In today's home exercise tutorial, we are going to go over something that I keep bringing up in a lot of the videos I've done recently. And it's kind of like a big picture look down on rehab progression, or really more specifically movement progression. So I give little bits and pieces here and there of my mindset or my rationale or mentality behind how I build progression within each session. And then I've also titled videos like early stages of rehab, intermediate, advanced, to characterize a video based on where I think that video fits into someone's rehab progression. But I get tons of questions in the comments. Where do I start? This is where I'm at. What do I do now? And so I thought maybe to help those of you out who don't really know where to start, where to go, where you're gonna be going to, kind of give you a framework that is based on some of the principles, not all, some of the principles that go into the decisions that I make as far as how to progress someone's exercises. And the two big concepts are the stages of motor recovery and the stages of motor learning. And those two are the big picture concepts that help me to decide which exercises to choose and when to choose them. So if you feel a little unorganized or disorganized in your rehab and you want to put a little bit more structure to it and you want to be able to search for the best exercises for you, then this video is for you. But before we dive into that, if you're new to this channel and you haven't yet subscribed, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, turn on that notification bell so that you'll be notified every time I upload new videos. So, stroke recovery or movement recovery in general for anyone who's lost movement due to an injury to your neurologic system. In the beginning, you start out, you have no movement at all. Big picture. Then you start to get a little bit of movement back, but they're usually in synergistic patterns. So I know I talk a lot about abnormal synergies, but movement synergies are one stage in the movement recovery process. If you look at babies, they go through a progression where they actually do a lot of these movement synergies that I'm terming now abnormal. And that's because we hit a certain age where they integrate, and that's when we usually start walking, that we learn how to move outside those synergy patterns. That leads into the next stage of recovery where you initially learn how to move in synergy patterns, but then hopefully you progress through that and you learn more coordinated movement where you can move out of synergy patterns. Now, one key element to transitioning from in synergy patterns or movement in synergy patterns, the stage right before moving out of synergy patterns, is that the brain learns during normal development how to inhibit certain muscles. So that is why you are able to isolate joint movements and you don't have multiple joints moving at the same time. So visualize a baby. They're either all flexion or all extension. As their brains develop, they actually learn how to quiet their system down a little bit and inhibit certain muscles so that they can move out of those synergy patterns and crawl and walk. So I have talked about this a little bit in some other videos, but it is worth kind of just reviewing for those of you who haven't seen that video. And so that is kind of the main big picture principle that lays the foundation of deciding whether something is an early stage activity, intermediate stage activity, or an advanced stage activity. It's usually dependent on where you're at in that process. Now, there is one caveat, I guess you would say, to that, and that is the realization that you can plateau at any stage in that process. So the ultimate goal is to kind of work through that plateau. Most of the time, it's that people get stuck in that stage where they're moving in synergy patterns and they can't dampen their brain down, or the brain is not learning how to inhibit certain movements to move past that where they can isolate joint movement. The other factor to keep in mind is spasticity. Spasticity is a whole separate concept altogether. I've done a whole series on that. I'll put links for those videos in the description below so that you can learn more about what that is. But if you have spasticity, that as well will be one hurdle that you have to overcome in order to be able to get to that stage where you can isolate joint movements. Now, the next question to ask yourself is, what exercises do you choose based on where you are at in the stages of motor recovery. And here is where I'm going to challenge some of you on the way that you're approaching your home exercises or the way that you approach your searches that you do online looking for the best exercises for you. And we're going to move away from muscle strengthening, and I've done an entire video on this, which I know a lot of you have seen, but I will put a link for that video in the description below because I think it's really important, where I talk about the difference between developing strength and developing motor control. And we're going to kind of stay on that same mindset, but I'm going to challenge your thinking once again. And instead of thinking resistance training, which is all based on how do you make this muscle generate more force, we're going to kind of move away from that a little bit and think more in terms of range of motion. So range of motion is the arc that any joint can produce. So full range of motion or normal range of motion is the maximum arc that that joint can move through. And most of you, when you're in those stages of recovery, in most cases need to think more about the range of motion and less about looking for strengthening exercises. Once you can actively move a body part, a limb, a bone, and you don't really need to know angles or degrees, just do it with your uninvolved side. And when you can do them both and they look the same, then you've probably achieved full range of motion. And can you do it against gravity? Which means, can you move that bone perpendicular to the ground? Gravity eliminated would be parallel to the ground. Against gravity would be perpendicular to the ground. And can you move that limb against gravity through a full range? Once you get to that point, then you would switch over to looking for more strengthening activities. But until you get to that point, we're going to think more in how do you increase your range of motion through a full range of motion, or what is a normal range of motion. So step one would be passive range of motion, and that is when either someone else moves that limb for you or moves that arm or leg for you, or you do it with your uninvolved side. That would be step one. So if you're in that first stage of motor recovery, which is no movement at all, then you would definitely want to be doing passive range of motion every day. And then the next stage would be active assisted range of motion. So that's maybe where someone helps you a little bit and the muscles that move that bone do a little bit of the work. And active assisted range of motion, the goal is to decrease the amount of external assistance you're getting and increase the amount of power or force generated by that muscle to move that limb on your own. Other forms of active assistive range of motion is using TheraBand. So a lot of times we think of TheraBand as adding resistance, but TheraBand can also be used to assist a movement and help you to get through these stages of range of motion. And there is no shame in staying here for a really long time. The more you improve and the easier it gets with a little bit of assistance, the more your brain is going to be able to get to a point where that movement is automatic. And I'm going to get to that a little bit later. And then of course, the next stage is really to get to active range of motion. And that's without assistance. And there's really two levels in this active range of motion section. I talked about it a little bit earlier, against gravity or gravity eliminated. When you get to this active portion, You want to start with gravity eliminated because that's going to be a little bit easier. And there are a variety of ways you can do this. The idea behind this is that you would get your body in a position to make that movement parallel to the ground. So for instance, if you wanted to work on reaching and you were in that early stage, maybe that flaccid stage of recovery, you would want to get on your side and move that arm up and down on your side. That would be the easiest setup or position to do in the initial stages to get that arm to start reaching. Some other examples of gravity eliminated would be laying on your side to work on hip flexion or hip extension, knee flexion or knee extension. Those would all be movements if you wanted gravity eliminated to do on your side. And then on top of that, if the arm or the leg is resting on something while you're doing that movement, obviously that'll add friction, so that makes the movement a little bit more challenging. So then our next goal would be if you're in the super duper early stages and we try it with your arm on a surface and it's not moving, to somehow eliminate friction. So either that's letting it float in the air, or there's a few other variations for the arm and the leg. So for the leg, I use these suspension bands to kind of keep the leg floating in the air. And for the arm, I'll either use, again, some kind of a suspension system to let it float in the air, or something that'll move with the arm. So have the arm resting on something that'll move with the arm. So once you can do a full movement, gravity eliminated, that is a sign that you can progress on to the next stage, which is against gravity. So now you would want to move perpendicular to the ground, much, much harder. If I was transitioning someone from gravity eliminated to against gravity and they just could not do the movement, I would go back to that previous principle and let them do it in synergy, because remember, movement in synergy comes before movement out of synergy. So I would try and actually facilitate that in synergy movement. So for instance, if I wanted to work on ankle dorsiflexion, flexor synergy is with the knee bent, so I'd also bend the knee. So those of you that are working on lifting your foot up, you want to start with the knee bent. Those would be some ideas or suggestions that I would keep in mind or be mindful of or use to modify some of the activities when I am deciding what exercises are best to get that initial movement from that gravity eliminated to against gravity. And then, of course, beyond that, you could start adding resistance. Now, there's one other big principle or big concept that is critical if you have any injury to your brain. So everything I've been through so far could really apply to just any type of injury, orthopedic injury. All therapists kind of use those two, or I'm not going to say all, but a lot of therapists, at least in part or some part, have those two concepts in mind that I've already gone through: motor recovery and those different progressions of activities as far as gravity eliminated to against gravity. But then there's another concept, and that is motor learning. Now, motor learning is the same from birth to death. It's how we retain the ability to perform a movement, and the end goal is automatically, where we don't really have to think about it. So you know you have learned a movement fully when you can perform it without really even thinking about it or being aware of it. You see gymnasts do this, elite athletes do this. even runners, they probably work on shaping a little bit and stuff in the earlier stages of their running career, but eventually they just have that motor memory to do that efficient form over and over and over and over again to be the fastest runner. So really, this applies to everyone. So anytime you're starting to introduce a new skill or you're trying to progress to a new skill, there's a lot of thinking going on. You usually need a lot of feedback. So I know a lot of times people get a little bit upset or annoyed at family members that are always chiming in and telling them when they're doing something right, or telling them more often than not when they're doing something wrong as far as movement. I hear spouses, their husband or wife tells them all the time how they're walking hunched over, their posture. But keep in mind before you get irritated by your family member that that's actually feedback. And if you could kind of reframe how you're receiving that information, it could actually be an extremely valuable tool in the early stages of motor learning. So keep that in mind. Listen to what they're telling you and maybe rephrase it in your mind in a way that resonates with you, that you can actually do something positive with it or constructive with it, and make the corrections that they are saying. So I tell this to my patients a lot that are getting irritated. Family members don't need to be therapists to know what looks right and what looks wrong. So most of the time they're probably on the right track if they're giving you some feedback as far as what your walking looks like. The other things that you can do in the early stages are definitely use a mirror, take lots of video and watch it back. I use video a lot during my sessions with patients. That's all feedback. So that is teaching you how to see right from wrong, know what the correction needs to be or know what you need to do, and then actually be able to make that correction. All of that is in the early stages of the motor learning is going to help you as you progress through the learning process. And then the next stage of the learning process requires a little less thinking, a little less feedback, and you're a little bit more accurate more often. So you might get to a point now where you actually start to do it right more often than you do it wrong. And then the final stage in the motor learning process is the automatic stage. So when you become an expert in a movement, that means that you can do it with very little feedback and your accuracy goes up. So you perform that movement consistently the majority of the time, and it doesn't require a whole lot of thinking. So to get from that middle stage where you're doing less thinking to that automatic stage, that's when I usually start introducing some of the things that I've talked about, dual task or split attention activities, to help divert your attention away from that movement to really get it to the point where it becomes automatic. And that is really the ultimate goal, especially for those tasks that we do every day. Walking, getting in and out of a car, getting in and out of bed, getting in and out of a shower, getting dressed, all those things. You don't really want to have to do a whole lot of thinking when you're doing them. You want to get those skills to a place where they are automatic. And those are just some suggestions as far as how to get to that point. So I hope this was helpful. I hope this will help you to know which exercises to do or what stage you're at. And remember, this is different for each body part. Some people have more leg involvement than arm involvement and vice versa. So it is specific to each joint. Just because you're at the automatic stage for one movement doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be at the automatic stage for another movement. So you really start this process over with each new movement. But again, I hope it was helpful. If you liked this video and you want to see more videos like this, definitely hit that subscribe button, turn on that notification bell, sign up for my newsletter. The link is in the description below. It's just a way for me to stay connected with you throughout the week. I also have a website that has a lot of helpful information on it just to help you and empower you in your rehab journey. So definitely head over there and check out some of the blog posts that I've put over there, that I've posted over there this week. As usual, I enjoyed spending time with you all today, and I will see you all in the next video.